Normally on this show we get crap or shite manufacturing. Now we've kind of like moved on towards shite customer service. What ensues in this is frankly appalling. The client or the customer should not really know more than the manufacturer. Anyway, let's get to it. Hello Hambini fans and welcome to another episode of Hambini Reams. In today's episode, all the way from that cesspit hairdressing capital of the world, Austria. You were expecting me to say China, weren't you? No, I wouldn't say that. These, which are Verve InfoCrank, and it really is going to be crap, cranks. These are a power meter crank, and they were sent in by a viewer. Viewer said he had basically creaking and a few problems with it, and he wanted me to make a new bottom bracket for it. Now, he had tried a few different bottom brackets on this. So he tried a Praxis one, and the bearing arrangement for that is currently fitted, just as an aside. He'd also tried a ceramic speed one, and the outcome was the same in both scenarios. Before we go any further, let me just weigh these, because these weigh an absolute bucket load. So they are 900 grams. Now, later on in this video, I'm going to detail why I hate a lot of bicycle engineers, because the customer service associated with this was absolutely fucking diabolical. Anyway, this is the InfoCrank crank. I think the power meter assembly is basically behind this. I haven't taken it apart, don't need to go in there. That cover and that cover. I'm guessing, although I haven't checked, it's split because well, basically you've got two compartments. This is one of those assemblies where the drive side is split at the crank spindle, and the non-drive side crank arm is the one that comes off, so it allows you to put it through your bike. I've just undone it. It's a fairly standard assembly. You've got a series of splines on the crank axle, mating splines on this side, and then a self-extracting bolt kind of thing to screw it all together. Where this gets a bit interesting is the bearing assembly and the preload and all that kind of good stuff. So this is the non-drive side. That bearing is a 28mm bore and 30mm on the OD, and it's a 7mm thick bearing. I've just a spacer there so I just don't lose it. It's got a raised lip on the inside. That's a non-standard size. This side has a standard 6806 bearing, so that's 30 on the bore, 42 on the outside, and then it's 7mm thick. This system is licensed by Praxis. So Praxis made the chain rings on here, and they are of reasonably decent quality. I would say they were quite well made looking at them. The machine quality looks good. Obviously they have been used, but other than that, I wouldn't really think too much about them. The crank arms look like they're forged. You can see the forging and then machined afterwards. There's none of that hollow stuff in there. You've also got, it looks like the transmitter, which is here, or some of the electronics on the drive side arm. And then the corresponding non-drive side arm, you've again got this. So I think it's true left-right diagnostics for the power. Now, in engineering, 90% of the diagnosis is the history. So I know the chap said he'd had creaking, and the other visual clue, hugely visual clue, is the bearing seats. Now this bearing seat is absolutely immaculate. There's no marks on there whatsoever. You'd hardly even tell there was a bearing there. This one, which is the non-drive side, has been absolutely hammered. So you can see, if you look there, look at the wear marks there, where the crank arm position is, it's completely opposite. So when load is applied, it's applying load there. It's probably at that kind of angle, but you know, it is perfectly in line with that. You would expect a corresponding mark on the other side, but there's nothing there. Now the fact that two bottom brackets had the same fault suggests the fault lies either in his bike or in the crankset. In this case, I think there's a fatal design flaw in here. This is the Praxis bearing kit that you get with it, and it's a fairly standard affair. You've got a wave washer, the bearing, and a little, it's a spacer seal kind of thing. Now this way this bearing setup works on this crankset is this bearing is fixed, so it doesn't move, and this one is just like a purely radial bearing, but it still needs an element of preload. That preload is provided by the wave washer. Once you put the wave washer on, like that, and then put the spacer seal on, okay, you're left with half the bearing seat gone. So if I actually just get my depth gauge and measure that, it's like 100 mil, 100.95, maybe slightly more than that. And that's before I've compressed it. Basically, as soon as I put the bearing on and then compress it, even if I try all my might, I can't compress the bearing so it seats fully on the bearing seat. So it's half off, and hence it rocks. And that's where I think, well, I'm fairly confident, his creaking is coming from. The basic problem is this shoulder or bearing landing is too short. On the Praxis version of the crankset or the axle, this is much, much longer. On most cranksets, the way to fix this preload problem would be to put shims on the centre and then move the bearing up and then allow for the preload wave washer to take up the slack. But we can't do that on here because this landing is too short. So instead, we have to shim the outside of the bearing housing. One of the issues with displacement preload adjustment is you always need some shims. So all I've done here is, this is a 6806 bearing that we're trying to sort the preload out on, and then I got a piece of metal, parted it off at different lengths, and I'm going to use that for the preload. So we have to do a few small measurements to get this to work. I've put the bearing into position and pushed it fairly far home. I've got the non-drive side bearing in, that's just loose but it's up against the shoulder, and then my depth gauge here. Now if I put that up and then up to there, it's about 82 millimeters. The bearing is 7 millimeters thick, so if we take 82 minus 7, that gives us 75 millimeters. So the spacing between that point and that point needs to be 75 plus the preload clearance. So this is the bearing shell, or one of my housings, and this is the 28mm bearing that I'm going to push in. Now normally I have a tolerance on here, but on this one I've gone a lot more accurate than normal, so it's basically dead on. So each of those ramps up to those shoulders is 9mm deep. A press, and then we can screw that one in. So that's now home. So the bearing's in. This was the customer supplied bearing. It's an Enduro bearing. There's not really much wrong with it. I wouldn't say it's of great quality. As I pushed it in, you can see the grease has actually come out. The seal on it is allegedly LLB, which is non-contacting. Just to work this out, now we've got this ramp shoulder there, so that is basically 9mm. If I get that right, yeah, it's about 9mm. Oh, this isn't a perfect method of measuring. And then to the other end is 81mm. So 81 take 9 gives us 72mm. So that's, we need a target of 75 plus or minus a little bit. So we need to put 3mm shim in there to allow for the preload. And we need to put the preload shim in and then put the bearing in. So the preload shim just goes in there. It's a tight fit. There we go. Got it going. I'll push the bearing in and then we'll assemble it and see what happens. Now there's a subtle difference here. This is the ceramic speed bottom bracket and this is my one. See, the bearing is flush with the edge, whereas on that one it's slightly dropped from the edge. So the edge is slightly raised. So what I've done here is I've put the spacer in, the spacer shield in. That has a bit of play in it, so if the bearing isn't quite fully pushing that down, we'll be able to move that. This is the assembly, so if we put that in, as if we're going to load it up. I don't think that'll move, but I'm quite pleased with that. But we'll clamp the other side on and just double check. Push this down. Oh yeah, that's a good fit. You cannot over tighten this crank. The way it's designed with that step down on the non-drive side means you can't overdo it. In the sense that you'll do the preloading. That's in. Oh yeah, I'm pleased with that. Right, so let's just check that that doesn't move. Now, normally, if you had the expense, I would do what's known as an axial float check. So actually put a clock on the end and then bump it from one side to the other, but that's probably a bit excessive on here. That's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's not moving at all. So that's a result. So this is the final result. It's a system which was basically a compromise. In an ideal world, you wouldn't want to have this preload like this. You go for the wave washer, which is what Praxis intended, but the Verve implementation of this is functionally wrong. Right, it is that time of the show again. I'm quite angry with this one. I think it's appalling. Verve Cycling, info shite, another bunch of fucking jokers. There is this like crap manufacturing, and then there's just crap and appalling customer service. The fact that the individual, well, you'll see what happens. By Hambini, age 5, let's just check that pen's working. Got my pad the wrong way around, look. The pen is working. Right, let's carry on. Right, InfoCrap or InfoCrank, whatever the fuck they're called. They describe themselves as the world's most accurate power meter. Now the website says it's Australian with a UK office and something about Austria. Take from that what you will. They have tried to fob me off. I think it was a fairly big fob off. I gave them an opportunity and they screwed it. Right, let's see the website. This is their website. They describe themselves as the world's most accurate power meter, and they've got all of these teams that they sponsor. So Cycling Ireland, Canyon ZCC, don't know who they are. The Story cycling team, so she is a Paralympian. She had a hand that got damaged while she was still in her mum's tummy, and yeah, she's got her own team now. I think it's her and her husband Barney, and these are all the things that they have. Why InfoCrank, IC2 guide, shop InfoCrank, all of this kind of good stuff. They have been all over the press, as you would expect. This is the Bike Radar review. I'm not really here to comment on the accuracy of whether it is accurate or not. The only thing I would say is if you do look at this, which is the one that's being used by Bike Radar, take a look at the wear on one side of there and say if that looks normal. I mean, it doesn't. The journalist has probably looked at it and not really commented on any of that. This is DC Rainmaker's review. Again, he's gone through it and he's really more into the sort of the variables, the numbers and stuff. And I can't really blame him for that because that's his area of expertise. And if it was me, you know, I've got no idea. And to be honest, I don't really care if one is more accurate than the other, provided you just got a consistent reading. This is all his business about putting the crank in the bottom bracket. And he did mention that he had to have a beta bottom bracket from Praxis. Don't know what that was about. That looks like a Park Tool press. Then we go from there. That's more Bike Radar. And then this is what I got from the internet search about who InfoCrank were. So this guy's called Brian Taylor, and he is I guess the owner of the business, and you can read or listen to an interview with him on Alpine Coals. There's 178 views on there, and I think 10 of them are me. So I was just listening to what he was going on about. Right, and what I've done here is I've drawn a schematic. This is how it's supposed to be, right? So you've got the wave washer here, bearing here, and then I haven't really drawn this very well, but there is actually a step in the shaft around here. So this is the non-drive side, and that one is the drive side. And the way that works is this bearing here is clamped, so it's taking the load that way and that way. This one over here is just taking radial load. And this wave washer here is just sort of there almost to just preload this bearing and put that one into sort of tension that way. It's not a great system because you'll always have a little bit of movement sideways. It's not very much, it might be like 20 microns or something like that. But if you are, you know, a really good cyclist, what will happen is the bearing will wear and then that 20 microns of clearance will inevitably get bigger. If you've got a Shimano crank, Shimano it's a preload system that's infinitely adjustable. So as you wear the bearings, you can just dial in a little bit more of preload and then you take that sort of slack out. But the preload is not really the problem here, the immediate problem. The big problem is, and I've drawn it over here, is this drive side bearing. If you look here and here, the bearing's kind of like half off where it's supposed to be. So it's just literally hanging in midair. So the bearing and the axle will tend to rock that way and that way. And that also causes an uneven wear pattern, which is, again, something that we've kind of like seen. Now, the solution to that is fairly straightforward. So again, this is what we have, and this is what we're going to go for. So I've drawn it in orange there. So what we're going to do is put a spacer in there, and that will move that bearing outwards. But we've got the crank chain rings here. God, I'm really poor at drawing straight lines. So we've got a finite. Oh, I'm just going to rub this out. How do I rub it out? Oh, you can just turn this thing over. Right, let me try again. That's better. There's the chain rings there. So we've got a finite amount of space, so we can't just sort of put the wave washer back in. So we've got to take it out. What that means is this wave washer, you know, you've got like 2 to 3 millimeters of compression there, probably a bit more. Okay, but I think that's a reasonable number. Over here with this, the compressibility of the spacer, you might as well say is 0. So you have to set that gap. Let me just rub this out. You have to set this gap absolutely cock on, because you need to take out the slack in the systems, because you're taking out the wave washer. The effect that has is because the bearing is moved that way, it now locates fully onto the axle. In an ideal scenario, what you'd normally do is, if you're going to do preload like this, which is displacement preload, you'd put the spacers in here. And for almost all systems, that's valid. Even if, like on a Shimano crank, you can put those spacers onto the axle. It's easy because the client or the end customer can just add sort of these Delrin washers, no problem. Over here, this is more of a problem because you've actually got to take the bearing out to do that. So you need some fairly accurate measuring gear to set it up. Also, as it wears, you will need to add more spacers in there. And that's something that you just can't get around. The bearing, and this is a bit of a, it's a bit of a contentious situation, this. Some people, I'll just say some people, like, you know, I went and had a little chat with people about this, is whether that's to make that an interference or a slack fit. So a slack fit, a clearance fit is, you know, what you would normally say, or close clearance. The bit in between interference and slack is called transition, or interference and clearance, but I use the word slack because it's derived from the word vagina. The problem with that is, you know, if you have to take the bearing out every time, then it becomes a ball ache. So you're losing in one hand from stiffness, but on the other hand, you've gained from easeability. So I've just gone for stiffness. Right, this is the video I sent to InfoCrank explaining the problem.
Hello, Annabelle. First of all, thanks for responding to me. This is the Verve InfoCrank. This side's okay, so this is the 28mm side. That bearing's fixed, no problem. This side, over here, we've got a landing there where the bearing sits, and you can just about see the groove, hopefully. So that is 7mm deep. This is the preload assembly that appears to come in the manual, which I can find because they referred to this. So we've got a bearing, a dust shield which varies in width, and this wave washer. Now, if you put all that in there, that's much thicker than the 7mm, so you end up with half the bearing hanging off the end. Now, I don't know if that's normal or not, so yeah, if you could get back to me, that'd be great. Thanks.
So I thought I was fairly kind in that video. I don't think I was mean at all. And this is what came back around that. So I've copied and pasted it word for word, and then you can read that. But I mean, this is just stupid. I mean, does she think I'm an absolute fucking fruitcake? Ceramic speed B-bright bearings seem to be 5mm. Then with a 2mm dust cover that makes up 7mm you talk about. Blah, 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 blah. She even references their chief engineer. Who the fuck is this chief engineer? Does he know a 6806 bearing is always 7mm thick? I mean, fuck me, right? Here's the evidence. This is the ceramic shite bearing on the bottom, and this is another bearing over here. Look at the difference. It's just, it's there for anyone to see. You can just see the difference there, 7mm. Don't know. That's the bottom bracket that came with it. And then we've got to talk about preload. So this is the preload explanation. Jesus Christ, this is more like epic. Is it epic bullshit? This is semi bullshit, and my judgment is probably clouded because I think they are an absolute bunch of fucking clowns. Anyway, you read that. InfoCrap chief engineer. These are the Praxis instructions, so you can have a look at this. This is, you can get these instructions actually from their website, from InfoCrank's website. So it describes, the wave washer in there to set it up, and even there on that, if you get a measuring tool to measure the pixels, let's say, that one is 28mm. You can work out what that landing width is, and it's just there's a fault in the crank. There is just definitely a fault. So this is the Praxis axle, right? And this is a screenshot, or it's the shot from the one that you've seen in this video. This is considerably narrower than this. There's also some subtle differences, and the subtle difference is around here, there's no lip, whereas here, there's a very small lip. So this one doesn't have a problem with it. It just works. Right, the C-nut-ish shitbag scale of engineering fuckwittism. The lick, the shears, not a shitbag, borderline shitbag, definite shitbag, C-nut-ish shitbag, and speck of shite on the aims for humanity. So we've got SRAM, 9 velos hubs, which are definitely the lick, spokeless CFD, spreadsheet wankers, there's plenty of them on that triathlon website that people rave on about. Shimano, I mean, they've just been rambled by the US authorities. Thank God for them. Merkel, I still love her. And Richie and Toby, who are pretty decent guys, actually. Fuckwits who don't understand tolerances. Zero Fiction Cycling. Now, this wanker's going to get reamed shortly, but we'll save it for him. I've been lining him up. And InfoCrank. That is where they are. And the conclusion in all this, crikey, right, the average cyclist probably knows more than the average customer service rep. And I think, you hear so much about people getting fobbed off, so don't get fobbed off. And make sure you share your experiences on the internet, because they'll only change when it hurts their wallets. And when things are in isolated situations and people aren't aware that other people are having these kind of problems, the manufacturers sometimes get away with it. I mean, probably one of the best examples of that was Shimano got away with it for 11 years, 12 years. And the product is, in my view, it's physical, so the item that you've bought, but also the service that goes along with it. And if, in this case, I think the service was a bit of a joke, and it leads me to believe that if you are, let's say, not a YouTuber with 100,000 viewers, that you're more likely to get shafted. Now, in this case, they probably didn't know who I was, and they probably didn't know they were about to be on the end of a rifting, but that's their loss. Right, that is the end of this video. If you did enjoy it, remember to smash that like button. If you didn't, go screw yourself. And as always, keep banging your hairdresser.